right, well, thank you all so much for joining us for looking back at 1948, a year of presidential decisions. 75 years ago, President Truman faced a series of monumental decisions both at home and abroad. At home, he had to deal with a divided Democratic Party in a presidential year. And abroad, he faced a crisis in the Middle East and a Cold War showdown in Berlin. Truman managed to come out of all of this successfully and even navigated a surprise presidential election victory. And so today's presentation is led by Mark P. Adams, who's the Education Director of the Harry S. Truman Library and Museum. So all 97 of us, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Mark for joining us this afternoon. And Mark, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Robert, and welcome everybody. And I appreciate the invitation and looking forward to sharing with you about this year in 1948. Before I do that, I didn't type into the chat, but I'm currently in Independence, Missouri. That might not be a big surprise, Harry Truman's hometown. And I'm actually physically in the Truman Library today, although the photograph behind me is a bit of a cheat. This is from our museum exhibit that we have here at our museum of Truman's Oval Office, but I'm not really sitting in there. Our curators would be really upset with me if I went and sat in our exhibit on the Oval Office. So let me get my presentation fired up here, and we'll learn more about this particular year, 1948. And we're going to be talking through this year. The photograph at the top kind of is a bit of a spoiler towards the end of the year with the presidential election and this famous photograph from that presidential election year. So that's going to be what we're going to finish with later on. But let me walk you through this incredible year for Harry Truman, and then we'll take all the questions at the end if we can. Just makes it a little easier to navigate. But like most historians, I'm going to make us go back a few years before we look at 1948. We're going to look at just one event really that shows Truman background before we get there. These are some of the things we're going to be talking about. There's lots more, but we're going to be talking and highlighting these 5 events of 1948: civil rights, the Marshall Plan, the crisis in Israel, crisis in Berlin, and then the presidential election itself, which is the photograph at the top. As I said, we're going to go back just 3 years to start with, just to give us a little bit of context. I'm a big fan of context, so you kind of know where you're coming from. And this is April the 12th, 1945, as you can see from the caption there. And of course, this is the day that FDR dies in Georgia and Vice President Harry Truman comes into office. This is the inauguration from April 12th, just after 7 o'clock at night. This particular photograph, there's a bit of a glare on the clock above the fireplace in the background, but it's approximately 7:09 p.m. in the White House, and Truman is there with his right hand on the Bible, swearing the oath of office. You can see all these grim, serious faces around him because the country is in mourning. FDR has died that afternoon. And then the lady directly to Truman's left, kind of right in the center of the photograph actually, is new First Lady, Bess Wallace Truman. They'd been married since 1919. And slightly obscured in the picture to Bess's left and to our right, you can see their one and only daughter, Margaret Truman. She was in Washington, D.C. at the time, and the 3 of them rushed to the White House for this ceremony and to console Eleanor Roosevelt, who was actually in Washington at the time. And then you see the folks there around the room. There is one other female in the photograph, just out of interest. Over on the left, you'll see a head bowed with a black hat, and you just see maybe half of her profile there. And that's Frances Perkins, the Secretary of Labor. She was the first female that was ever elected into the cabinet. That was by FDR, and so she was the standing Secretary of Labor at the time. And then you see the other cabinet members and other officials around the room as Truman is sworn in on April the 12th, 1945. So that's kind of sets the stage, 3 years before our year that we're going to be looking at today, but kind of giving us a sense of when Truman becomes president and so forth. We're going to be looking at, like I said, 4 major issues of 1948. In some ways, it's somewhat of a chronology because the civil rights issue emerges in February and then again in the summer. The Marshall Plan is signed in April. The Israel crisis comes to a head in May. Civil rights comes around again in July, and then we have the November election. So we're going somewhat chronologically. Again, for civil rights, as we're looking at this particular photograph, this is actually from 1947, the year before, where things come to a head. As you may realize, 1948, it's the 75th anniversary this year in 2023 of all of these events, hence the focus on that particular year for me at the library. And we're doing a lot of 75th anniversary programming here at the library as well. But back in the summer of 1947, 76 years ago, Truman is the first president to address the NAACP, and that's what this photograph is showing. And in that speech, very historic speech, as he's addressing an integrated audience and primarily African-American audience, he starts to talk about civil rights for all Americans, which, although there'd been mentions of this by previous presidents, not in the same way that Truman was talking about, taking it to another step. Of course, in 1947, outside of the presidency and outside of anything Truman did, we have the integration of baseball with Jackie Robinson. So it's important to remember these things are happening at the same time. Ultimately, after Truman gives this address to the NAACP, he then sends a message to Congress in February of 1948. So that's why we're starting with civil rights for this momentous year, 1948. 2nd of February, 1948. Now, it's a little unusual, this message to Congress. He doesn't go into the chamber. He doesn't address a joint session, which he did on other issues like the Truman Doctrine. He sends a message. He sends a written message rather than deliver a speech in front of everybody. He sends a message to both houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives, about civil rights and calls for legislation from both Democrats and Republicans in both chambers to pass various civil rights initiatives that he's pushed forward. It's by his supporters, of course, it's well received. By the African-American community, it's well received. But the Republicans, for the most part, and even more so, members of his own party, and particularly the Southern Democrats, are wholly opposed to Truman's attempts to put forward legislation to Congress. Now, let's just step aside for a moment to remember, although Truman had been elected vice president in 1944 with FDR, and then they took the oath of office in January of 1945. And as we'd seen in the previous slide, he'd become president in April of 1945. In the 1946 midterm elections, the Democrats actually lost control of both the House and the Senate for the first time since 1932. So FDR, dominated the presidential elections. He was in his 4th term, and he had control of the House and the Senate. So for the first time in 1946, Truman faces a Congress that's wholly, at least he doesn't have the majority. In addition to not having that majority, as I mentioned, the Southern Democrats are kind of beginning to pull away, particularly over the civil rights issue. So it's a pretty difficult one for Truman to navigate as he's trying to get these types of legislation passed. He's facing a minority in Congress, and even with his own party, the Southern Democrats are threatening to pull away and to form their own party. This comes to a head in the summer of 1948 at the Democratic Convention. And as they put forward the civil rights plank that the party is going to run on in the 1948 election in November, the Southern Democrats actually walk out of the convention. I can't imagine that happening today with modern political parties, but the delegates from those southern states, they walk out and they form their own party, the Southern Rights Party or the Dixiecrats, led by Strom Thurmond. So Truman is really struggling here. People are saying he's definitely going to not win the election in November. The Southern Democrats have all walked out. It's going to split the vote. What does he do? Well, he can't get through things through Congress. So in July of 1948, he issues 2 executive orders. That's the little notation down there. The EO means executive order. And I put the number there because it's a really key one, and you can look it up later if you'd like. The executive order 9981, a very famous executive order, and that is to integrate the military. So as he is the president and he is the commander-in-chief, although he can't get things through Congress because they will not pass the legislation and so on, he decides to use his executive power as president, and he actually issues 2 executive orders that day. 9981 integrates the military and forms a committee to make sure that it happens, and we'll talk some about that in a moment. He also issues Executive Order 9980, and that integrates the federal workforce. As he's the chief executive, as the president, he is over all of the federal employees in the land, and he also integrates the federal workforce. So if you think about your civil rights history for a moment, of course, we know the big landmark case for civil rights in the schools is in 1954 with the Brown v. Board case in Topeka, Kansas, just down the road from here, about an hour from here. We're close to Kansas City in Independence, Missouri. And that integrates the schools in 1954. And of course, we know there's a struggle, and it takes the Little Rock 9 crisis in 1957 and so on. So that's a struggle in the late 50s. But here we are in the late 40s, and we have the integration of the military and the integration of the federal workforce. So in some ways, Truman's ahead of his time, but critics would say he could have done more in his administration too. So this is one of the major decisions he makes. It's bypassing Congress, goes to executive order. He forms a committee to get this enacted. So it isn't just a case of signing the executive order and then leaving it alone. He has a committee set up to push the military along. And in fact, of all the different branches of the military, the Army is the slowest. So the other branches start integration plans immediately. The Army really drags its feet. So he has committee members going to the different branches of government and really pushing them along. In reality, it takes the Korean War, starting in the summer of 1950, 2 years after this, to really accelerate the integration of the troops. And by the end of the Korean War, after Truman's left office in 1953, when the war ends, when the Korean War ends, at that point, the statistics we see now are that by the end of the Korean War in 1953, 98% of all forces are integrated. So it takes about 5 years. So it's not a quick process. Different branches of the military really drag their feet, but it takes the Korean War to sort of accelerate that. So that's one of the major things there that Truman had to deal with at the beginning of the year in February, but of course it carries on into the summer, and then even after that, there's repercussions into Truman's second term. This is one of the political cartoons at the time. This is one of my favorites, and you can see here on the mat, you see civil rights is on the mat that Truman is standing on. And then you see the lady in the doorway there. If you look very, very carefully at the feathers on her hat, it says Miss Democracy. And then there's an umbrella there behind her. And then this particular cartoon was sent to Harry Truman by the cartoonist Berryman in March of 1948. And then he has this unusual phrase that people have kind of lost the meaning of this now. He says, I stand pat. And that means he's going to stand firm on this issue, and he's standing on this issue of civil rights. He's going to stand with it because there's so much protest, some in favor, some against what he's trying to do. And he had Miss Democracy with this very telling phrase, you mean you'd rather be right than president? So there's this idea, this is the right thing to do, but is it going to lose him the election? So Truman is saying, I stand pat, I'm going to be quite stubborn on this issue, and I'm going to stand for this issue no matter what the criticism, I'm standing for this. It comes from an old card game when you don't want to take any more cards. You're going to hold and not draw any more cards. I stand pat is kind of where it comes from. So kind of an interesting cartoon, this idea that, well, he might be right, but he may lose the election is kind of the inference. So kind of a fun one. I kind of like political cartoons, gives us a different way of looking at some of these fascinating historical topics. And then one of the things I wanted to point out, and this is something maybe you want to look at yourselves, we can only touch on these issues today, but you might want to look at some of these incidents or Google some of these people. The one people think about Truman as a Southern Democrat. He's from Missouri. His grandparents owned slaves prior to the Civil War, things like that. He grew up, with his family, but mostly Southern sympathizers and so forth. So how did he get to this point of advocating for civil rights? He uses racist language in some of his letters that he writes to Bess when they're dating, even back in like 1911 and so on, and other times too. We don't sugarcoat that here at the Truman Library. We have those letters on display. He uses the N-word in those letters. So how does he get to this point in 1948? A lot of historians point to this particular incident, but it's one of many, unfortunately, where African-American soldiers who'd fought in World War II in segregated troops came home and then received mistreatment. In this particular case, Isaac Woodard, who's featured here, was blinded by South Carolina police when he was on his way home from the war. Truman was so horrified by this incident and others in 1946 that it leads him to form various committees, reports on civil rights, and ultimately his decision to integrate the troops, amongst other things, in 1948. So this particular incident comes to his attention, along with other incidents that are happening to African-American troops in Georgia and other places that he's just horrified by. So that's one of the explanations that historians use to kind of look at this conversion of Truman towards the civil rights cause. This is one of the reports that came out from Truman's committee that was put forward on civil rights. It's called To Secure These Rights. And this is the one that gives lots of recommendations to improve conditions for African Americans across the whole country, social and political things that they recommend in this committee. And it's out of this that the idea of integrating the military is one of the recommendations, amongst others, within this particular report. This is a scan of the executive order that I mentioned earlier, 9981. Not only does it establish the integration of the military, but as I mentioned, it establishes this committee on the equality of treatment and opportunity in the armed services. So they follow through this committee to make sure that Truman's executive order is enacted as it should be. So that's civil rights. We're going to move on with time. We've got 4 or 5 other issues to get through, and I'm cognizant of the time. One that most people actually associate with 1947 is the Marshall Plan. And the reason for that is that George Marshall's address at Harvard is in the June of 1947. But the legislation that comes out of that Marshall speech on European recovery doesn't actually get enacted until April the 3rd, 1948. And that's next Monday is the 75th anniversary of the signing of the legislation. It's quite a long process, as you can imagine. As I mentioned already, it's a Republican-held Congress, but it is a bipartisan effort, and it does come through. There are some naysayers, but for the most part, just like the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan comes through bipartisan help, mostly from Senator Vandenberg, who's a Republican, who champions this cause. But the Marshall Plan 75th anniversary of 1948, next Monday, so timely for our presentation today. And this is a photograph, actually, of Truman signing the Marshall Plan. In all, over 4 years, and this is an astonishing figure, the legislation calls for $17 billion in aid. That's in 1948 money. We translate that now, it's probably in the region of around 175 billion. I did the calculation a few weeks ago. It's probably gone up even more since then. So getting close to $200 billion in today's aid to 16 countries over a 4-year period. This is on top of the money that was promised in 1947 through the Truman Doctrine, and then other aid that had been given to Europe since the end of World War II in 1945. So in some ways controversial, but Truman navigated that. You see that it's called the Marshall Plan rather than the Truman Plan. And one of the middle quote there is one that kind of gives that away. This is a Truman quote. All three of these are all about George Marshall from Harry Truman. The second one there is the one I really want to focus on, and that is, I've decided to give the whole thing to General Marshall. The worst Republican on the Hill can vote for it if we name it after the general. So Truman's thought was, well, if it's named after me, it might be a rocky road in Congress. If it's named after George Marshall, who's the Secretary of State and has spoke about it the previous summer, then it's going to get passed. So the Marshall Plan was its kind of name in the works after the Marshall speech in June 1947. Previously, Truman had regarded George Marshall as the greatest living American. And the last quote, one of the best things we have here, one of our finest collections we have in our archives and in our museum, we have both here on site, are Truman's letters to Bess Wallace Truman, his wife. We have more than 1,300 of those letters on site here. And this is just an example of one page of one of those 1,300 letters. And this is from July of 1947, not long after that speech in June. And he talks in this letter to Bess, had a grand session with Marshall today. He's one fine man. Now, this is a private letter to his wife, and he's still gushing about Marshall. So he had held him in the greatest esteem. And it's no surprise that he names this plan after him. There's a few people behind the scenes here that helped form this plan. Truman himself, of course, George Marshall, of course, Dean Acheson, some others that maybe not as well known, but maybe some of you are familiar with George Kennan and others that have really planning the process behind the scenes. And a lot of it is how to handle the Soviet Union after the Potsdam Conference, where Truman meets with Stalin and Churchill in July of 1945, just a few months after Truman becomes president. Shortly after that, of course, the Soviet Empire is expanding into Eastern Europe, and that's becoming more and more of a challenge for Truman and his advisors, and they're trying to figure out what to do. At the same time, Marshall and others are talking about the economic ruin of World War II, the industrial breakdown across all of Europe, and they come up with this plan and of how to help fund those countries, even those defeated countries like Germany and Italy. The plan, the aid was also offered to the Soviet Union and to the Eastern Bloc countries. And in the spring of 1948, the Czechoslovakians actually want to attend that conference right at the time that the coup takes place, and the communist takeover. So there's more and more concern in the United States about communism, Soviet expansion, but even more so, I would argue, about the just economic and industrial devastation of Europe, and how that if that continues, then that's obviously going to affect the American economy as well. This is a map of the aid. This is a fascinating map, actually, because this comes from a book that was presented to both Harry Truman got a copy and George Marshall got a copy of this Marshall Plan kind of at the halfway point. They presented these volumes, and I'm going to show another photo from this in a moment. And you can see the darker, the grayed out countries here are the ones that received the aid. And you'll notice the white countries to the east, Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, those countries were all offered that money and the aid, but the Soviet Union forced everybody to turn that down. And then you'll also see a white Spain, and because of Franco and the conditions in Spain, the aid was not offered there, but you can see it is in Portugal and all these other European countries. So fascinating book that shows kind of the progress of the aid about halfway through the Marshall Plan, halfway through those 4 years that the money was given for. I wanted to share, I think I've got one other image. This one I find fascinating because it connects to Harry Truman and his home state of Missouri. This is a photograph from Greece. And not everything that was sent was money. It was industrial goods, in this case, animals. So it's kind of a fun photo in a way. You've got this Greek farmer, And then on the right, we have a Missouri mule. And if those of you who know anything about Missouri mules were used in World War I. And here we are in post-World War II, a Missouri mule working in Greece. And on the left is a Greek myrrh. So you've got this cooperation, forgive my analogy or metaphor here, but you've got this cooperation between Greece and the United States through their animals helping plow the fields in Greece. So it's a very poignant photograph of the types of things that were used in a very small way in this particular case. This Greek farmer with his Missouri mule and his Greek myrrh working together. And that was the plan. The European countries were going to work together with this $13 billion in aid. As it turned out, the legislation was for 17 billion. By the end of the 4 years, they spent 13 of that. So 4 of it went unspent, which surprises me when I read that. But it was done efficiently. And it did, in fact, save Europe, as we can see today. It leads to things like NATO, the European Union. Things like that are a strong legacy of the Marshall Plan as these European countries came together to figure out the best ways to spend the money. It wasn't a case of just handing out the money. They had to come up with projects that would be deserving of funding. We're going to move on. I'm about halfway through my time. I've got through 2 issues, and I see some Q&As and chats. We will get to those, I promise, at the end. So the next issue for Truman, the Marshall Plan that legislation is signed in April, on April the 3rd. The next issue that faces Truman, the fireworks or the crescendo of this takes place in May. But of course, the issue of Palestine has really been bubbling since the end of World War II. Just as some quick background on that, at the end of World War II in Europe, you have displaced persons all over the map in Europe. Many people are not wanting to go back to countries where they were persecuted, or in fact, their home cities were just destroyed. So you had not just Jewish people, but many others too, displaced persons camps all over Europe. Reports are coming into Truman, most notably the Harrison report of how bad these displaced persons camps actually are. There's lots of immigration to the United States, to the United Kingdom and others, but there's quotas in place that restrict that. And so the World Zionist Organization, amongst others, start to call for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And that goes to the United Nations, which was formed in June of 1945, just 2 months after Truman is sworn in as president in that photo we saw at the beginning. The United Nations is formed in San Francisco in June of 1945. Truman does the closing address that month. And the issue of Palestine and Israeli settlement there is taken to the United Nations. There's different plans put forward, one of separating the area into 2 states and so forth. Well, very controversial. The Arab population locally is against most of the plans. The Jewish people are against some of the plans. It's so difficult, in fact, that even Truman's own advisors are split on the issue. Let's look at a couple of letters that come into Truman first, because the general public is also divided. It's probably one of the most divisive issues that Truman faces. And again, remember, we're in an election year. So this is one from a gentleman, Edward Place. And if you can see that on the screen, that's great. I'm just going to read a couple of lines in case it's a typed letter, so it shouldn't be too difficult, but I know sometimes via Zoom, you may not be right next to a screen. You might be sharing with others. But a couple of sentences here too, that it says, know that the Jewish people have absolutely no moral right or legal right to land which their ancestors have not controlled politically for more than 2,000 years. The civil rights of the Arabs must be observed. So this particular gentleman is tying into our previous topic as well of civil rights. So these things are happening at the same time. As you can tell, I chose this letter deliberately because it talks about the Palestine issue, but it also talks about civil rights too. So he says in the next sentence, I'm completely opposed to US civil rights program. if for no other reason than the fact that our country must be united against world communism at this time and not divided by communist agitators. And then he uses that civil rights piece in his last paragraph. The people for partition of Palestine and your civil rights program seem to be practically identical. And so what he's saying, and he says it at the bottom of that first paragraph, the civil rights of the Arabs must be observed. So he kind of points out a contradiction to Truman. You're about civil rights at home, but what about the civil rights of Arabs? And that really your attention should be more towards communism. Truman would probably argue that the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan are attempts at that, but the gentleman is certainly worth valid opinion that he's making. And then on the contrast, and of course, this is from a Jewish source, American Committee of Jewish Writers, Artists, and Scientists, writes to Truman in April of 1948, so right as it's coming to a head. And he talks about, I'll give you time to look at this. It's a slightly smaller font, but again, it's typed, which I chose deliberately. It's a letter directly to the President Truman from the president of this organization. And he's telling the president that they're about to salute this Jewish state. It's going to come in existence on the evening of May the 15th in Tel Aviv. So they know this ahead of time. And 60,000 people are expected to signify their presence and close ranks and be supportive of this new Jewish state. And he's saying that World Zionist Organization is going to proclaim the state on May 16th, actually at midnight. So May 15th, about 6 p.m. Washington, D.C. time. We'll see why that's important in a minute. And he's asking Truman in the second paragraph, you're a friend. We want you to send a message. We want you to lend your moral support. We want your support for this new Jewish state. So they're asking Truman to support it, to validate the cause, so to speak. So as you can see, these are just one letter from each side. Truman received hundreds, if not thousands, of these letters on both sides. And as I mentioned before, his own cabinet was split. So we mentioned George Marshall earlier. George Marshall is against Truman recognizing Israel, whereas other cabinet members are in favor. So it's a very, very difficult decision. There's a big showdown meeting on May the 12th, 1948. It's been dubbed by historians later, Showdown at the Oval Office, where Clark Clifford, special counsel to Harry Truman, later works for John F. Kennedy, amongst others, is faced off against Secretary of State Marshall as they both present their argument. Clifford in favor of recognizing of Israel and Marshall against. And Marshall is so angry about this and even threatens to vote against Truman in the 1948 election, which, can you imagine, Secretary of State coming out and saying he's going to vote against the sitting president? It would be scandalous. Fortunately, he never went public. Unfortunately, they were able to calm Marshall down eventually. But Truman does end up recognizing Israel. And this is the copy of the statement that he releases. And a couple of things I want to point out here. Just going to move my own window out the way here, see if I can. I've got my own thing blocking the screen. You'll see here there's a couple of things that, and this is in Harry Truman's own handwriting, so it's cool to see, where he inserts the word provisional government. So it isn't just a blanket recognition of Israel, but of the provisional government. And what they're saying is, we want you to have elections. We want you to have democratic elections. And so fast forward to January of 1949, they do in fact have democratic elections in January 49. And then Truman issues a full recognition after that in late January of the following year. The other point that's interesting, there's two really, is that they don't know the name of the country when Truman drafts this. So it says de facto authority of the new, and then originally it said Jewish state. Well, by the time it's declared by the World Zionist Organization at midnight on May the 15th, they use the term the State of Israel. So Truman scratches that out, puts in State of Israel, signs his name. You see the signature there. and then approved May the 14th, 1948. And I think Truman was very cognizant of history. He writes down at the bottom the time. And the second one, actually, on the original document, you can see it a little bit better. It's a 0 and it changes to 1. I feel like the clock ticks over to 11 as he signs it. So it's 11 minutes after Israel has been declared a nation in Tel Aviv, Truman recognizes Israel. And with doing it so quickly, just 11 minutes later, Truman becomes the first world leader to recognize Israel. Not without controversy, not without debate, not without argument. The delegation in the United Nations, the United States delegation, is surprised at this action. They're uninformed. In many ways, Truman does this kind of by himself because his cabinet is split. Although I think his close advisors, Clark Clifford and others, after the May 12th meeting that I talked about, after that, his mind is made up. But still, just 2 days later, 2 days prior making that decision, and then to do it so quickly, to recognize so fast. As a result, Truman is often lauded in Israel. And so in our museum, just one little snippet of one of our exhibit cases are some of the gifts that have been given to Truman, some at the time, and then some later in life, and even after he's passed. Things are still lots of recognition for Harry Truman being the first world leader to recognize Israel so quickly, 11 minutes after it becomes a nation. Okay, we've got one more issue and then we'll get to the 48 election. So we should be right on time here. We've talked about Stalin. We've talked about the Marshall Plan. The biggest crisis in Truman's time in 1948, though, despite civil rights and despite Israel, comes through the Berlin crisis in the summer of 1948 that almost leads to World War III. As you might remember from the Potsdam Conference in the summer of 1945, where Truman met Stalin and Churchill, Germany has been divided into 4 nations. Here we go. I've got a slide to go with that. I should have fast forwarded that first. Germany's divided. They didn't quite use the terms West Germany and East Germany yet. That comes in 1949. And of course, we're about 1948 today. But the country is divided into 4 zones after the war. So the Eastern zone, the red zone there, you can guess by the red, that would be the Soviet zone. And then the green, the blue, and the yellow are the French, the American, and the British zones. If you look very carefully, though, you'll see Berlin way inside the Eastern zone, the Soviet zone, east of the Elbe River. Berlin itself has those 4 colors. So Berlin is also divided into 4 zones. Now, I just want to take a quick time out for historical accuracy. There's no wall yet. The Berlin Wall comes in the 60s. But those zones are established, and those Allied countries look over those 3 zones in the west of Berlin. So again, the French, the British, and the Americans each have their own zone. Well, there's crisis in the spring, and the Soviets blockade Berlin temporarily and then lift it again. And things are very anxious between the East and the West. In the spring of 1948, you can see Czechoslovakia to the south. The Soviets have marched in and put down a protest and basically installed a puppet state in Czechoslovakia. They were still a combined country back then, under now Soviet control. There's been other areas around Europe where the Soviet troops have not left or they've installed puppet states. And so there's increasing tension between the 2 sides. The 3 Allied countries, the British, the French, and the Americans, are increasingly being concerned. And ultimately, in the summer of 1948, in June, Stalin blockades Berlin. Now, if you look at that map, what that means is he blockades the roads, the autobahns, he blockades the trains, and even more importantly, thinking of the technology in 1948, he blocks the canals. So there's no way in and out of Berlin on the ground. So the roads, the trains, the canals. So all the supplies coming into West Berlin, way inside the Eastern zone from those colorful zones over on the West, are all cut off. So there's no way in and out. Now, those western zones in Berlin in 1948, that's a population of about 2 million people. So it's a really very difficult crisis. And don't forget, it's a presidential election year. So how do you handle such a crisis at that time? Here's a close-up of the Berlin itself. So you see the East Berlin and the Soviet sector there east of the Spree River, and then the French sector to the north, the British sector and the American sector to the south. And you see Potsdam on there too. And then the rivers that are so important for transportation, and then some of the airports, Tegel, Gatow, and probably the most famous from that time period, Tempelhof, in each of those sectors where ultimately aid is going to be flown in. So the temporary decision was made to fly in supplies, to fly them in from those western zones into West Berlin, temporarily keep the population alive, and then we'll figure out what to do. Some of the military want to march tanks in. Truman was reluctant to start World War III as he thought that might be antagonistic. So I've got this wonderful cartoon. I mentioned earlier that I love cartoons. And there's Truman and Stalin facing off with tiny little, looks like cocktail sticks, tiny little swords. You see on Truman's hip the atomic bomb, because at that time in 1948, the United States is the only country that has an atomic bomb. And then of course, these giant figures of Stalin and Truman are fighting in the rubble of Berlin, which of course is still devastated from World War II. So I think both sides, according to this cartoonist anyway, both sides are facing off, but they're both trying to avoid going to World War III. So the airlift begins in the summer of 1948 and continues, and this is another photograph from our exhibits in our museum, continues for about 15 months. They carry on, even though Stalin finally lifts the blockade 15 months later. They carry on, or about 11 months later, they carry on doing supplies for about 15 months. They're trying to deliver about 2,000 tons per day per individual. And so you can see the numbers of pounds of supplies there, 4 billion pounds of supplies, almost 300,000 flights in a year, just under 600 flights per day. I want you to think about that number for a minute, 600 flights per day. So that's a plane landing about every 30 minutes and being unloaded about every 30 minutes too. So just an astonishing effort. At that time, it was the largest humanitarian effort in world history as they continued to stockpile and build up supplies for the West Berlin population. Ultimately, Stalin backs down and Truman is successful in saving West Berlin. And then by 1949, East Germany is set up, West Germany is set up along those same boundaries, and of course, West Berlin and East Berlin, and we know the stories of that in the 1960s and then ultimately in 1989, with the wall coming later, not in the 40s. But those zones are really what the same geographic boundaries are set, the Potsdam Conference, and then reinforced through this Berlin crisis. So Truman is able to hold off World War III, but a very tense, tight moment with the military calling for an invasion. Others saying, forget Berlin, walk out. They were our enemy 3 years ago. Leave it alone. So again, mixed messages from advisors that he sticks by. Okay, we have about 15 minutes left, just long enough to get to the 1948 election in November. And then we'll certainly have time for questions after that on any of these issues. So the main candidates people recognize are President Truman and Governor Dewey out of New York. And this is the two of them. Of course, Truman on the left, Governor Dewey out of New York on the right. Dewey had lost to FDR in 1944, but ran again. Very popular candidate, very popular governor. But of course, I've got two other names on the screen there. Strom Thurmond, I mentioned earlier, he's the leader of the Dixiecrats, or the Southern Democrats, that had walked out in that summer, and they were going to be running really against Truman more than against Dewey, and going to divide some of that Democratic vote in the southern states. And then Henry Wallace, who was actually FDR's previous vice president before Truman, who'd been put aside by FDR, bit of resentment there maybe, and Wallace runs with the Progressive Party, accuses Truman of being too hard on the Soviet Union and is far more progressive with his policies and wants a more cordial relationship with the Soviets. So Truman has actually got a four-way fight in the election, but he knows his main opponent is Thomas Dewey. He's not too concerned about the other two candidates based on his advisors' confidences. This is one of my favorite items that we have in our museum. This is an original Norman Rockwell painting, which is issued about 3 or 4 days before the election on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. And then Truman is able later to have this painting donated to the Truman Library. You see the gentleman on the left pointing at Thomas Dewey and his wife across the table. And you can describe her body language. And she's obviously supporting Harry Truman with her newspaper. You've got the crying baby under the table, the dog, the cat. There's even a bird in a cage above the breakfast table here. So you can kind of see a sign of the times with the way they're dressed. But really Norman Rockwell is trying to get across that the country really is divided. Families are divided. It's going to be a very close election. Although all the pollsters were giving the election to Dewey, the country was very divided. Some of the reasons we can go into with the Q&A if you'd like about the polls being wrong, but the pollsters had stopped about 2 weeks before the election, and it seems like there was a late surge for Truman, but we can get into some of that here in a minute. Really, the election comes to a head back in the summer in the 1948 convention when those Southern Democrats walk out. Truman makes a fiery speech at 2 o'clock in the morning. He calls for the Republican Congress to come back in session and pass the legislation they're promising, takes a gamble. They end up doing that, and he ends up using that against them in the September and October Whistle Stop campaign, where he accuses them of being the do-nothing Congress. Most of Truman's attacks, when he's giving speeches all around the country, travels 29,000 miles on the train. They're not against Dewey, they're against Congress. Remember the 46 midterms? Congress is against him. So he's also trying to win back Congress too. But he accuses them of being this do-nothing Congress, and really doesn't attack Dewey very much at all, maybe once or twice. Most of his speeches are about Congress and how they haven't done anything to help the American people. And then he makes this big statement in the middle of the speech, and Barkley is going to be his vice presidential nominee, Alvin Barkley. Senator Barkley and I will win this election and make these Republicans like it. Don't you forget that. And he has this fiery delivery that gets the whole convention all fired up after they were being pretty down after the Southern Democrats had walked out. As you know, about this famous campaign, he travels around on the train on this whistle stop campaign, going from every small town to every large town in the country, travels all around. He doesn't go to every state by any means, but he goes to the states that he's targeted, 29,000 miles plus, as I mentioned. The crowds are huge. This is from a small town in Kansas, and you can see them right up at the back of the train. He would often come into a small station, make a speech, go into a larger town, do speeches in auditoriums and so forth. But he was really well known, as you probably are aware, for these back of the train speeches, huge crowds coming out, because for many of them, they'd never seen a president live and in person. FDR was in a wheelchair. He'd been in office since the 1930s, and they'd not seen a president live and in person. They'd heard FDR on the radio, but they hadn't seen somebody come to their own town like this. Of course, what was also popular was he often campaigned with his family, and there's Bess on the left and his daughter Margaret in the center, and they were incredibly popular. They didn't make long speeches. They would probably just say hi to the crowd. Truman had tailored messages for every town. So his script writers would give him bullet points about each town so he could tailor his speeches to those audiences. So they would do research ahead of time on the train the whole time. He got these different groups behind him, the African-American vote, the Jewish vote, And in this case, I love this photograph, the housewives for Truman. So that's a really cool photo that's from our archives here. We have about 100,000 photographs. Many of them are available online on our website. And of course, we have color photographs and even color footage from the campaign chain as well. And of course, every politician likes to shake the hand of children or hold babies. Truman's no exception. And this is a wonderful photograph. I believe, if I remember correctly, this was taken in Denver, Colorado. Great photo. And I'm sure the proud dad behind the daughter here probably voted for Truman based on his smile back there. Probably most popular of all was Margaret Truman, his daughter. She was born in 1924. So in 1948, she's 24 years of age. She campaigned tirelessly with Truman along with Bess, and she was incredibly popular whenever Truman went on these motorcades or the back of the train. So he really used his family to help him get support. Of course, the campaign styles were very, very different. This is my third cartoon, so you can see I really like these cartoons. So Truman was known for his fiery speeches. You see the sweat on his brow. They called it the Give 'em Hell special. He's fired up. This is obviously in the Southwest. You see the cacti and so forth with the landscape. Whereas Thomas Dewey, the brotherly love special, according to the cartoonist, Dewey tends to give the same speech in every town. Truman tailors his to every town, makes it topical for the town, brings in the local representatives. Dewey is also reluctant to attack anybody. He doesn't attack Truman. He had done a little bit of that against FDR in 44, and his advisors felt like it kind of backfired against him. Truman, although he's attacking Congress, as I mentioned before. He's not really attacking Dewey that much because he realizes Dewey's a fairly popular figure, but he can attack Congress. When he's in an industrial town, he campaigns for industry. When he's in a farming town, he's campaigning for farming. When he's in to the VFW, he's campaigning for veterans. Remember, Truman was a business owner that had gone bust in the 20s. He was a soldier in World War I. He was a farmer for 11 years. So he used those different backgrounds and experiences with the audience as he faced them. So here's the results. We'll wrap things up here. Truman does win just. You can see the percentage in the electoral count, and I'll show you a different color there. In this particular map, Democrats are blue and the Republicans are red. Surprisingly, some of the farm states, Oklahoma, Texas, and so on, go Democrat. You see the orange, that's the states' rights, so the Dixiecrats going for Thurmond, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, and so on. So you can see where that did take some of the Electoral College votes away from Truman, but he has enough to win. And then this another thing, quick cartoon, upsetting the apple cart. This is Truman and Barkley with the cart turned over, all these apples, polls, predictions, trends, because all the pollsters had said Truman was going to lose and Dewey was going to win. Here's an easier chart to read. It's just wrapping up now, where you see the Electoral College vote is quite substantial, but of course the popular vote is only a 3 million difference. And then you see the numbers for Thurmond and Wallace. They're almost tied, but Wallace gets no electoral vote, whereas Thurmond is able to get 39 electoral votes. And that's some of the reason the pollsters thought that Truman was going to lose, was because he was going to lose these Electoral College votes for Truman. But he does much better in the farming, some of those farming states, than people imagined. So we have this famous photograph. And you can see my change of the title there, Truman defeats Dewey, because he did. But of course, this is Truman on the train in St. Louis. He's been in Independence, Missouri the night of the election, hides out in a nearby hotel till the next morning, heads on the train back to Washington, D.C. He's been declared the winner about 4 a.m. He hops off the train in St. Louis, his home state still in Missouri. He's just traveled across west to east of Missouri, but he's still in Missouri. Takes about 4 hours to drive that now. Gets off and they hand him this newspaper from Chicago. Of course, we know about the Chicago-St. Louis rivalry. They're only too happy to share this newspaper with him, and Truman holds it up for eternity in this photograph. with a big smile, and the Dewey defeats Truman. Incidentally, we've got an original copy of this newspaper on display in our museum, and you can't see it in this photo. You'll have to come visit. But the last column on the right of this newspaper, there's 4 lines upside down. So the print setters had set the type in incorrectly. So that headline was not the only thing that was wrong in this particular newspaper that day, but the main thing that was wrong for sure. Okay, I am going to stop my screen sharing. There's my email address, and our website address is trumanlibrary.gov. But if you wanted to look at some of those documents, you can go to our library online collection section. Click library and then online collections, and you see thousands and thousands of online documents. So right on time, I would say, maybe 2 minutes to spare. Robert, how's that? We will take questions.
Fantastic job, Mark. And we do have some questions and comments already. So get them into the chat and Q&A, folks, and we'll go for about 10, 15 minutes here. So Gail notes that I've been to the Truman Library in Independence, Missouri. Independence is well worth a visit for Truman lovers and others. There's lots to see in the town.
And one thing about that, because I wanted to invite her back, because we just finished a $30 million renovation of our museum last May. So we've been reopened almost a year now. So if you haven't been in the last 10 months, please come see us. We've got brand new exhibits, $30 million renovation. So please come. It's absolutely spectacular, even if I say so myself.
So let's see here. I think some of these you kind of touched on, but so Peter asks for a refresher. What is the Truman Doctrine?
Oh, I apologize. I didn't give any context to that at all. Sometimes when you know the information, you just assume everybody else knows it. I apologize. So in 1947, both Greece and Turkey were under communist threat, internal protests, communist pressure from the Soviet Union. And so in 1947, Truman was able to get bipartisan support for $400 million in aid for Greece and Turkey. But within that speech, and he does a speech to Congress in March of 1947, he makes a speech where he says he will protect any countries that are threatened by outside governments. He doesn't mention the Soviet Union by name, but we all know what he means. And that becomes known as the Truman Doctrine, to protect countries threatened by outside governments. Far different than isolationism before World War II. So hope for that 10 seconds answer clarifies that for you.
And then Peter also asks, what was the Berlin crisis after the Potsdam Conference?
So that was the issue that I mentioned, the surrounding of Berlin by Stalin, blockading it so that the West could not get access to West Berlin. So that was the crisis that ensued that I described. It led to the airlift to bring supplies in because Stalin had blockaded Berlin for almost a year.
Mike says, interesting in the train cartoon, it has Dewey in a smoky steam engine and Truman was shown in a modern diesel.
Very similar. They were actually in very similar type trains. Cartoonist Liberty there. Dewey traveled almost as many miles, probably 1,000 or 2 less. In fact, Truman always commented that he had a shadow following him because he would be in say in Boston one night and then Dewey would be there the next night. So they kind of followed each other's paths, but their styles were very different.
Pat says, great recap of 1948, very timely. Gail says, thank you so much. Wendy says, how come Truman didn't run for a second full term?
Yeah, very good question.
The Google search, the Google machine indicates a lack of popularity.
Yeah, let's go with that because they didn't quite have the term limits that we do today. So he'd done 3/4 of, if we had done 3 3/4 years and then a full 4 years, 48 to 52. He could have run in the 52 election. He decides not to. I think the main reason is the Korean War. The Korean War starts in 1950, and during that Korean War stalemate, Truman's popularity decreases. So he sees the writing on the wall. There's calls for Eisenhower. Truman really wants Eisenhower to run as a Democrat because Eisenhower has actually not declared a party. But eventually Eisenhower does declare a party, and much to Truman's chagrin, it's Republican, and Eisenhower sweeps in 52 over Adlai Stevenson, who was the Democratic candidate. So it is popularity. Mostly the Korean War is what really damages Truman's popularity at the time.
Gail says, Truman's home is really charming, not what one might expect. It's a terrific house museum.
Yeah, and it's very, very small, and it's actually run by the National Park Service. You can tour it. Yep.
Cecilia says, I've heard that telephone polls were used in the 1948 election, and that was part of the reason that Dewey was expected to win. Is there any truth to that? Did we have telephone polling back in 1948?
Well, they may well have done. I think they probably did. But the problem would be that's going to get to the more affluent voter. It's not going to be to every rural community and the poorer sections of community. So maybe that was one of the reasons they were off. What I've read, more historians use this particular explanation, is that most of the polling stopped about 2 to 3 weeks before. And they didn't capture this late surge in the vote, as Truman campaigned he was in Harlem, he was in Philadelphia, he was campaigning right up onto election day itself, November 1st, November 2nd, right up to the end. So they feel like those polls were suspended. They thought it was all over. That's the explanation I've seen the most. But that telephone poll one is interesting because it would explain the more affluent voters would have polls, and that would be more the Republican leaning vote for the most part.
So Mark says, are the letters to Bess Truman published in a book anywhere?
A couple of different ways to see those. They are published in a book edited by Robert Ferrell. It's Dear Bess, and then the editor is Robert Ferrell because he does a few little short paragraphs for context. But they're all available online. There's more than 1,300 of them. They're all on trumanlibrary.gov. And for each letter, we have a transcript for the letters. So you don't have to try and read Harry Truman's terrible writing. I never said that. It's recorded. Oh, his handwriting can sometimes be difficult to read. It's cursive. So we have them all transcribed as well. So you can see all of those on our website, trumanlibrary.gov, or there is a book, published volume, Dear Bess, and then it's edited by Robert Ferrell, Ferrell. Very famous. Truman wrote biographies of Truman and so forth. Yeah.
Susan asks, was Bess Truman one of the most reluctant first ladies ever?
She was, but people don't necessarily know the reason why. She was a very private person. Most of her time during Truman's presidency was actually taking care of her own mother. Her mother actually dies in the White House in December of 1952, the month before Truman leaves in January of 1953. So she's living in Independence most of the time, her mother is, in the home that Harry and Bess lived in. In fact, Bess's mother owned the home, and she's taking care of her. That's part one. Part two is that there's a family secret, and Bess does not want the family secret to come out. So now you're all on edge. What is the family secret? In 1903, Bess's father had committed suicide, and she did not want the American people to know about that. Mainly, there's a different thought about suicide in 1903, of course, but also her mother had suffered so greatly from that suicide of her husband. She didn't want her to have to live through it all again from 1945 to 53 when Truman is president. So she was very, very reluctant to do interviews. She did one press conference as First Lady, one. Compare that to Eleanor Roosevelt. It's dramatically different, the complete opposite. After that one press conference, she said never again. When she did agree to an interview, it was by her daughter, Margaret Truman, so she could vet the questions, because Margaret was in her 20s by then. So she was very private, but it was mainly to maintain this family secret, really so her mother, in very advanced years and ill, like I said, she died in December of 52. She wanted to protect her from having to live through this whole shame of the family tragedy all over again.
All right, we're winding down here. Martha says, great talk, very informative. I also have been to the library, the home, and the boyhood farm. It's a great visit. It's not far from the home and studio of Thomas Hart Benton.
That's right.
Thank you so much.
Of course, we have a Thomas Hart Benton mural in our museum that you can see while you're here as well. Huge. It's the largest item we have in our collection, painted on the wall in 1961.
Lois says, wonderful history refresher, excellent presenter. Let's see here. So Mike wants to know, do you have any comments or insights into the decision to use the atom bomb?
Yeah, it wasn't in 1948. No, I'm kidding. It's Truman never really regretted any decision that he made. Once he made a decision, he moved on. He had two goals in 1945 in August: to end the war as quickly as possible and to save as many American lives as possible. And he felt like the atomic bomb accomplished those goals. There was actually no guarantee it was going to cause a surrender. Some of his own advisors felt that. The problem he had was their plans for a land invasion. During the summer of 1945, the Japanese codes had been broken by the American forces. And they realized when they examine these Japanese codes that the buildup of Japanese troops on the islands was exactly where the land invasions were going to take place. So instead of having a 3-to-1 ratio for the military, the ratio was more like 50-50. And the military was getting more and more nervous about launching an invasion with those kind of odds. So the military invasion was kind of on hold, worrying about what to do. The Navy was actually ready to pull out of that plan completely. And then the successful test, the test takes place in July while Truman is in Germany, meeting Stalin and Churchill. On July the 16th, he gets word and he basically says, we have this new weapon, we can end the war, let's do it. And so on August the 6th and August the 9th, those two atomic bombs are dropped. He never regretted it. When people questioned him about it, he said, remember Pearl Harbor and what happened to us. And this got the war ended. Surrender came shortly after, signed the surrender document on September 2nd. So he never really looked back on it. He didn't regret it. I don't think he realized about the radiation. I don't think he realized about the number of civilians, but it accomplished his goals of ending the war quickly and getting American troops home.
Interesting comment. I'm a person who is alive today thanks to the bomb. My father was scheduled to be in the initial invasion, one of the first to land. So I'm glad it dropped. Yeah.
We hear that a lot, actually. We do hear that a lot. Thank you for your comment.
Yeah. Ellen says, did the shock and disapproval of our allies in Europe over segregation policies also influence the integration of our armed forces?
I think that's a fantastic comment. It was the civil rights debate was part of the Cold War. I'm going to pause there for a minute. Let me think about that, because the Soviets were actually using it against the United States. And, you know, as there's rhetoric going back and forth in the Cold War, as we accused Soviets of installing puppet states and, not having democratic elections in Eastern European countries, Soviets would shrug their shoulders and point and say, what about those lynchings? What about those African-American soldiers that are being killed? They got the news. And so it was part of the civil rights. Civil rights was part of the Cold War. The United Kingdom in particular kept sending messages to the US government, kind of embarrassed because they were losing the war of words over that issue. So there was some embarrassment on that, and it was also used against Truman. I think, though, although it was a big issue in the Cold War, I think the incidents I pointed out, the Isaac Woodard, and there was an incident in Monroe, Georgia, where 4 African Americans, 2 males and their 2 wives, were all murdered. Those incidents really hit home, maybe even more so than complaints from the Soviet Union.
Mhm.
But they were both a factor for sure. Great question, very insightful.
Daryl asks, what were the results of the congressional elections in 1948?
I think they were on the slide, but I went by it too quickly. Democrats won both houses back. I love it when I can answer factual questions correctly.
There you go.
They won them both back. It was on the slide, but I slipped right by it.
Was Truman's daughter very outspoken? Claudia would like to know.
Not really. No, not really. Truman was outspoken, so they didn't need any other member of the family. You know, when she was criticized for music critics, she was a singer, concert singer. When she was criticized for singing, Truman wrote to the music critic and threatened to give him a black eye. This is while Truman's president. So he didn't tweet it. He wrote a letter and threatened to, you know, give the music critic a black eye for criticizing his daughter's singing. So Truman was the outspoken one for sure.
Layla asks, why was Bess such an anti-Semite?
Well, there is talk about that. It's kind of, it's not a factual statement. It's whether it's an opinion. There are some discussions about that. Historians disagree on that. It's interesting because Truman ends up recognizing Israel. His best friend that he went into business with in the 1920s, before he went into politics, was Eddie Jacobson, a Jew from Kansas City that they'd fought alongside in World War I. So there are some discussions about that of whether she would not allow Jews into the home or African Americans into the home. Unfortunately, we don't really have that much evidence for it. So it's one of those that people speculate about. They relay, incidents, kind of oral history, testimony, but there's nothing in any of the documents. So it's a hard one. But different times, they both grow up with grandparents as slave owners. So certainly some racial prejudice. And I think the prejudice, the anti-Semitism is part of that too. Truman uses some anti-Semitic terms earlier in his life, and yet, in 1948, he recognizes Israel. So it's one of those head scratchers sometimes of how people change their opinion over time. But again, there's not a lot of documentary evidence for some of that. Some of Truman's letters are more revealing. We don't have as many as Bess's letters because she burned a lot of her letters. So we don't have as much documentary evidence of things that she wrote.
Bernice says, this has been a fantastic presentation. Mark Adams is very knowledgeable and a fine speaker. Visiting the Truman Library in Independence is on the top of my bucket list.
There we go.
She says, in 1964, I wrote my master thesis on the Latin American policy of Harry Truman at the University of New Mexico. There you go.
Point 4 is a very underrated program. And then I'm glad
two more quick questions. I'm not sure if they're going to be quick, Mark, but let's do two more real quick. Anonymous attendee, why was Truman unconcerned for the Arabs living in Palestine? Is it true that it was because he felt they were not a political force in the United States?
Actually, from all I've read, I think a lot of Truman's decision-making there comes because of the Holocaust. He gets all the reports from the Holocaust, from Eisenhower, from Marshall, and others who are on the ground, who are in the White House, relaying that information to him, and then followed up by the reports from the displaced persons camps. Then the other piece of that, I mentioned his name, Eddie Jacobson, who was a soldier with him in World War I, and they opened a clothing store together in Kansas City in the 1920s. Eddie Jacobson visits Harry Truman in the White House secretly and gets Harry Truman to meet with Chaim Weizmann, who's the leader of the World Zionist Organization. And Truman has a couple of meetings, again secretly, with Chaim Weizmann, and he convinces Truman to recognize Israel and support the Jewish cause. So I think it's far more that he's pro the Jewish cause than he is against any Arab cause, in my opinion. Truman's also a huge student of the Bible, and he felt this was like a culmination of the Jews coming home in that sense as well. He's a Baptist, and he kind of goes with that. Michael Benson writes a book on the recognition of Israel, and he uses the thesis of Truman's biblical upbringing as being one of the reasons. Others use more the thesis that it's Eddie Jacobson and the introduction to Chaim Weizmann, who's a very charismatic figure that convinces Truman to advocate for the Jewish cause.
Ron says that this was wonderful and informative. Final question goes to Cecilia, who asks, if a student was interested in working at a presidential library, how should they prepare to do that?
That's a really great question, one I don't get asked a lot. We are a federal agency. We are part of the federal government. So you've got to apply through USA Jobs. And usually people who are already a federal employee have a little bit of a step up. But we just hired somebody here a month ago who's a brand new federal employee, so it can happen. You've got to think of the different types of jobs and then tailor your academics or educational career towards that. So if you want to work in the archival field, working with the documents, you know, archival studies, things like that in your graduate degrees, undergraduate history probably. If you're interested more in the three-dimensional objects, like museum objects, like this TV set, look at that pointing on this.
Pretty good.
Truman was the first president to have a television in the White House in 1948, actually. And then, so that would be more museum studies. We're learning how to lead with a museum collection. Somewhere in my field, I'm the education director. So maybe a teaching background first, or a museum education degree is now available. You can get graduate certificates in museum education. So it kind of depends which part of the museum field. A general museum studies graduate degree is probably the minimal qualifications. And then within that museum studies program, focus on either archives, museum collections, or educational programming is probably the most common way into the field. Or work in a museum, work in an archives of any description, get that experience and move on up. I worked at a state museum in Topeka, Kansas for 6 years before coming to my job 26 years ago. I've been working here 26 years. So there we go.
Mark, does everyone in Missouri have an accent like you do?
So I'm originally from Liverpool, England.
Ah, there it is.
There you go. There you go. We didn't get that question. Usually third graders, that's the first thing they ask, but adults are too polite.
There we go. Okay, well, I'll blurt it out. Well,
there you go, Robert. Good job.
Let's give Mark a big round of applause, everyone.
And thank you. Great questions. Really appreciate your questions. Wonderful.
So folks who are watching live, I'll look for an email later today with the recording, the feedback survey, and upcoming program information, including the program on JFK tomorrow morning. I have a feeling we'll see Mark in a few months. We'll do this again on a different topic, Mark. I'm looking forward to it. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Thanks so much. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Robert.